Good morning. Great to see everyone here this morning. Good to see some folks back with us who haven't been here for a little bit. And always a blessing to see the regulars here. We know that some people are out traveling, but we're appreciative that you make this Sunday a priority and that you're here this morning. We have been talking this year about the three things that abide and abiding in them. Paul says that now abides faith, hope, and love. And we've been realizing that if these three things abide, we need to abide in them. We've been talking about abiding in faith and in hope in the earlier part of this year, and we finally come in our reflections to abiding in love. Now, in the coming weeks, we're going to be exploring love by exploring a chapter of the Bible dedicated to it, 1 Corinthians 13. Before we jump into that, I wanted to ask this question, and it might seem a little bit strange to pause and ask about the word love. What is love? There's so many things that come to mind based upon my education in 80s music when I think about the question, what is love? And there's other things that might come to mind that aren't biblical. So I need the Bible's answer as relates to the word love, because it really is a confusing topic. When I was a child, as I think about my story of love, I think about being a child and I really loved Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Like, I just loved them. I wanted to have every Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle thing. I never was given a katana, but I had, or the like metal size, but I had the staff and I had the nunchucks, and I would hit myself with the nunchucks all day long. A couple of wooden dowels with a chain between them, just wailing with those things, and just loved Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But then I became a teenager and my love changed. I loved Mexican food. I would go constantly to Mexican restaurants with my friends. $4.99 for chicken nachos, which is it's amazing that you get a whole thing of uncheesified nachos for free. Like in the South, you get this big thing of chips. And what do you want for your meal? Well, more chips, of course, but with some meat on it, please, and some cheese. And $4.99. Wow, that's a long time since then. But loved Mexican food. But then I got a little bit older. And I found a woman and I married her, and I love my wife. I really, really love my wife. No one laughs at that because they know it's true. We think about the term love, and we can see that even in that little brief story of love, that love is a word so rich in meaning that it actually leaves us with a very poor understanding. We have this word that is just so weak by really its overuse. And I think that when we read love in Scripture, we're being called to a concept that transcends, of course, the kind of loves that are exhibited in a child liking some imaginary heroes, or even our love for a food that we desire, and really even the love that we would naturally have for a spouse. We're called to a higher love, even in that relationship, than what we would naturally find without God involved. So, as we think about the word love, we encounter the word love in Scripture. We do so with tremendous baggage. We've got to learn to set aside that baggage and start to see love in a different light. And part of that is getting into the world of the Bible and seeing the words that they used and appreciating the fact that for them this concept was a little bit more varied and a lot more broad. We have one word, love, whereas the Greeks had several words for love, and in fact, 4 primary words for love. Depending upon what list you consult of the Greek words for love, you might find some other words that are tossed in here, but primarily 4 words for our one word, love. We're going to talk about those 4 words, and then we're going to explore really and challenge our understanding of love. All right, so the first Greek word that we're going to talk about is the word arao, or eros. Now, you might see the transliteration of that, eros, and you might recognize the beginning of the word erotic. And that is the way that word has come into our language, but it isn't exclusively that. It is a word that references to feel passionately about, to have a longing for, to feel fervently about. Basically, what we're going to find, I'll go ahead and tell you the end of the story from the beginning here. We're going to find that there are 2 words that deal with sort of affection and 2 words that deal with love. And both of them have something to do with your familiarity or with your connection with this. So yeah, when you think about desire, there is a desire for connection when there's eros. And again, that can be with a person, but it can also be with a thing. The classic Greek literature, it's not a word used in the Bible, so we can't draw from Scripture for it. But in classic Greek literature, you'll see eros sometimes being the word that they would use, like a philosopher longs for truth, or the way a slave loves freedom. The concept of freedom is attracted to, desires, wants it, feels fervently about it. We certainly have this emotion at play in the Bible, though the word is not used. And for example, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6, we are told to hunger and thirst after righteousness. We are told to desire it, to long for it, to want it as though we want anything else that we truly need. In 2 Corinthians chapter 7, though, when I think about the words that Paul chooses here, I think about probably the closest illustration of eros in the Bible. Nevertheless, God, he talks about the Corinthians who comforts us, the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus, and not only by his coming, but also by the consolation with which he was comforted in you. So Titus was able to encourage us based upon how he was encouraged with you guys when he realized the effect, effectively, that 1 Corinthians had upon the Corinthians, if that makes sense. So this is 2 Corinthians chapter 7, 6 and 7, and we're reading the effect that the first letter had upon them, and the Corinthians were able to tell Titus about their earnest desire, their mourning, their zeal. Earnest desire, zeal are words that travel with the word eros, and so there is a part to play that this word does have in our faith. The second Greek word that you see for the concept of love is the word stergo or storge. This is love and affection also, but you notice that at least one lexicographer was willing to connect it with the love of parents and children. And so how does that fit in with this word, with this idea of love and affection? How does it contrast with the word eros? Well, even though we don't have this word in the Bible as it reads on the screen, we do have it in a couple of places in different forms. One of these is in Romans chapter 1 and verse 31. It has an A in front of it. So if you know anything about etymology, that's something that we borrow from Greek. When you put an A in front of a word, that's like saying D or no or un or something like that. And so without natural affection. Now, I've chosen the older translations because the newer translations, in order to kind of make it more smooth, they'll just say unloving. But that's the word that's being used there. It's the word storge with an A in front of it, so negated. So without natural affection. I think natural affection is a good way of understanding it, because when you think about this word, it's really a desire or a fondness that is either automatic, natural, or developed through familiarity. So when you have the experience of a child being born. I know that a lot of parents can identify with this. There's a few who maybe struggle with this, and I don't mean to ostracize you in this way, but most parents have the experience of when their child is born, feeling an automatic, immediate bond to that child. And that child hasn't done a single thing to earn that. There's not even a personality really that you're aware of besides little movements in the womb that you might have been made aware of. My wife was one of those that continually while she's pregnant, she's like, come over here, feel, and I can never feel anything. And so like very occasionally I might feel something, and I didn't know what to make of it all. And she was always disappointed in my lack of reaction, and I'm sorry for that this morning. It's just, personality hasn't been formed as far as we really can see it on display, and yet we love this person. Well, that really is one way of using the word storge, and I think that's probably the lack of that is what Paul is talking about. Maybe you think of without natural affection would be illustrated by the parent who gives no thought to killing a baby before it is born. But there's also the idea of familiarity that develops this. And so I had a teacher once, he described it as old shoe love. I don't know that I can identify with that as much as maybe like old hat love. I used to have this hat, which conveniently got misplaced somewhere. I don't know what happened to that hat. But I used to have this hat that I wore all the time, and it was frayed, and it was sweat caked. But why don't you get rid of that hat? I love that hat. And that's the idea of storge, that can develop something that you really love. What's that? Oh, yeah, she's feigning innocence here, but I don't know what happened to that hat. Anyway. So the third Greek word is the word phileo or philos. And by the way, when you see these two, like the eo and the os, That's like the verb and the noun. I didn't point that out before, sorry. But the word philos, it is to have a special interest in someone or something, frequently with focus on close association. So this is our word that when we think about love and we think about emotional and relational connection, philos would be that word, right? It's the love of friends, it's the love of brothers, it's the love of a husband and a wife with each other. It's a love of a relational connection. There's another word, though, agapao and agape, all right? This is to have a warm regard for, an interest in another, to have high esteem for or satisfaction with something. And you're like, well, what's the difference between agape and philos? What's the difference between those two things? And the answer is, well, again, though there is a little bit of overlap in these terms, there's definitely an intended meaning behind them based upon familiarity and connection. Like eros and storge, the difference between agape and philos is primarily one based on familiarity. Like, how connected are you, and how much do you know? In fact, when you see one of the explanations of how the word predominantly is used in the Bible, the quality of warm regard for and interest in another without indication of the person who is the object of interest. In other words, you have this, but it doesn't really matter who it is. Or really, to the point, as we think about Christianity, you're commanded to have this, but it doesn't really matter who it is. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter what they've done. It doesn't matter what they are going to do. But then there's the expectation here. And I've kind of played my hand early here. So I'll go ahead and ask and answer the question. Which love did God use to characterize himself? Which of these concepts is the one that God used when he said, I am this? Was it eros? Was it storge? Was it philos? Was it agape? Well, it is agape. God is love. God was saying, I am agape. What is he saying, therefore, when he says that? I am that kind of love that has a fondness and an affection and holds in esteem and desires to help and do good in relation to, but without regard to who that is, without regard to what that person has done. And in fact, when we think about the love of God, as these songs that we've sang have emphasized, so often in contrast to what that person has done. The love of God was revealed to us while we were yet sinners, Bible says in Romans chapter 5 and verse 8, rather. And so that is the love that characterizes God. Second question, though, well, which love did God call us to more than any other? And again, we are called to agapao. We are called to love one another. Love one another. The love that God is the love that we are called to over and over and over again. All right, with those understandings in our mind, I want to do some challenging of our love. Because we, like I said, we have all this baggage that we come to the concept of love with. And if we're not careful, we can really bring that into biblical, concepts. And even in our relationship with God, it was brought out in Bible class. And I think that I've encountered this very same thing that was brought out so often. Somebody will say that, I have faith in God and I show love to people. I have faith in God, I show love to people. But the question then has to become, well, what do you really mean by that? And what does the Bible mean when it calls us to love? To challenge our love, I want to explore a little bit of what we got, brought into contact with in the reading that we had from John 21. So we'll be going there in just a moment. But to bring us up to speed of what's happening in John chapter 21, if we're not aware of that. So we have the disciple Peter and Jesus talking there in John 21. Peter, at this point, we're post-crucifixion, right? John 21. And so we're post-crucifixion. Prior to the crucifixion, do you remember what Peter said? Remember how he said in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 33, he said, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. I'll never be offended because of you. I will never leave your side or cease to be your disciple, and all people are going to be aware of the strength of my discipleship. But we know what happened that evening. We know how that very evening, after he was told that he wasn't going to be able to be a disciple on his terms, after he was told by Jesus to put away the sword and that those who live by that will die by that, after he was told to sheath his sword, how when Jesus was arrested, Jesus was brought to the courtyard, rather to a court to be tried, how Peter found himself in the courtyard and how there was a fire there. And practicality took over. He walks over to the fireside and begins to warm himself at the fire. But around that fire are not disciples because they don't really know what's going on that evening. I think a lot of the disciples of Jesus probably woke up on that morning, Friday morning, probably with news of what was happening, and Jesus really perhaps even already being on the cross by the time they find out about it. But Peter knew what was happening. He knew where he was, and so he's surrounded by all of these people who are not followers of Jesus, who are the very people who have gathered to see Jesus being crucified. That's probably in their hearts and in their minds. He's warming himself by the fire. And on three separate occasions, three separate occasions, he is asked about his discipleship. Now, when you read these in the gospel accounts, to give a little bit of comfort to Peter, or rather give a little bit of encouragement as it relates to his case, put it into context a little bit. When you combine all of those times where Peter is being challenged, it makes it seem like sometimes when we think about it, like he was just asked three times. But if you bring all the accounts together and lay them on top of each other, you realize that each questioning is really like a group of people questioning him. And so he's being barraged, basically. He gets three barrages. And each time he ramps up his defense of himself, and the defense of himself basically is that I'm not connected with Jesus, until the point where he literally is cursing and swearing to try to affirm that he is not a disciple. All right, so that's the backstory of John chapter 21. All of that happens prior to John 21. Now, Jesus is resurrected, and he appears to Peter and to the other disciples, but then perhaps tellingly, Peter decides one morning, I'm going to go back to Galilee and do some fishing. And so he decides that he's going to go back fishing. But of course, on that fishing trip, Jesus appears to them once again. Peter realizes it's him. He jumps out of the boat. He swims to shore. He's there with Jesus. And Jesus takes this moment to challenge his concept of love, a challenge that really, I think, is needed. And so when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? It's hard to say what the these is. I mean, do you love me more than your life as a fisherman? Probably, considering what he said before the cross, though, I tend to think that maybe he's saying, do you really love me more than everybody else? And he's perhaps being called to face up to what really he hasn't faced up to yet, the fact that he has denied Jesus. Do you love me more than these? Do you really think that you love me more than these? Now, the word that Jesus chooses to use as he thinks about love there is the word agapao, right? He says, do you agapao me more than these? Which again is that word that talks about, yes, love, but the kind of love that doesn't necessarily involve emotion. The kind of love that doesn't necessarily involve connection. The kind of love that doesn't necessarily involve relationship. The affection, the fondness that is given at times regardless of the person. And I think Peter hears that question, and maybe he thinks it's a test. Do you agapao me? And he wants to one up. He always wants to one up. He always wants to take it to the next degree. When he realizes that Jesus has to wash his feet, he says, no, wash my whole body, right? And so he hears Jesus say agapao, and he responds to him by saying, you know that I phileo you, so of course I agapao you. Of course I love you in that sort of non-connected way, because I love you in the connected way. I love you as a brother. I love you as a friend. And Jesus says to him, feed my lambs. But then he asks him a second time, do you love me? Is he challenging me? Peter might have thought. Is he testing me with all of this? Because once again, he asks the question, do you agapao me? Jesus, I thought we covered that. I thought we covered that. When I said that I phileoed you, when I said that I was emotionally bonded to you, when I said that you were like a brother to me, when I made a commitment to you in that way, of course I was saying that I agapaoed you. Did you not hear me? And so he says in response to him again, you know that I phileo you. You know all things. And once again, tend my sheep. We're convinced that the strongest love that we have is one rooted in relationship and emotion, aren't we? And time again, that's what we come back to. This is why we get so confused as relates to biblical topics. You know, I've had in a conversation with someone who was struggling with same-sex attraction, I've had the question asked of me, how can love be wrong? How can love be wrong? There's a relationship here. There's an emotion here. There's a connection here. And though we might, point to that and say, well, there are reasons why that is wrong, if we're not careful, our own relationship with God can be founded upon that same kind of reasoning. I love the family of believers that I'm a part of. I love thinking about the God who sacrificed for me. I love, thinking about all of the precious gifts that he continually brings into my life. There is a relationship. And I do feel an emotional attachment to all of these things. Oh, yes, that's true. But have I made the cold, hard decision to love regardless of those things? To love regardless of what is happening to me, to love regardless of what I am feeling like that day, to love regardless of how I've been treated, to love regardless of what's going to happen next, what's going to be in it for me. And if I haven't made those decisions, it doesn't matter how much or how strong my relational and emotional love is. If I haven't made that decision, then I haven't really chosen to love God at all. You see, the last time that Jesus asks this question, when he says, do you love me? He actually says, do you phileo me? Do you really, therefore, emotionally, relationally love me? He hasn't challenged that up until this point, but Jesus says, I need to challenge it now. Do you phileo me? Now that grieves Peter. It grieves him because he thought that was never in question. And he thought that the agape part would work itself out. But no, he has to think about whether or not he truly phileos me. You know all things, he says. You know that I phileo you. Perhaps in desperation and sadness at this point. And the same response is given, feed my sheep. If we want to phileo God, we're going to have to agapao him. If we want to be emotionally and relationally connected to God, we're going to have to love what he loves. We're going to have to love him. And that's going to have to be a decision that's made regardless of how we're feeling, regardless of what's inside of our hearts. Love is a choice. So let's talk about choosing love. And let's bring all of these concepts to bear upon this choice. All right, number one, as we think about that word that we, again, admitted wasn't in the Bible, there is still something to learn from the word arao. And that is that we ought to earnestly desire all that is good and godly. There ought to be a deep-seated desire within us to do what is right. We ought to hunger and thirst after righteousness. And there ought to be a deep-seated desire within us to make all things right, to be a part of God's mission of making all things right. But number two, we ought to become familiar with God's family until that affection becomes natural. Did you have to really think about what you were going to do this morning? Did you wake up and be like, well, not sure what's going to happen today. Oh, yeah, it's Sunday. I guess I should go to church. I mean, I know that's possible. And I commend you that if that was a debate that was in your mind and you still made the decision to come, I'm very glad that you did. But I can say that there will come a time that if you will persevere, that it will really just be a natural thing that you won't have to think very much about. You'll just know this is where I'm going to be. I love seeing how familiar this place is to us. You know, one of the things that I get as a privilege of coming here during the week is seeing the people who come here, and it's a hive of activity. People come in, they come out, they do this, they do that, they meet this person, they go and do that. It's like things are happening all the time. This place is so familiar, and these people are so familiar. And we can see these relationships stemming out into the world around us, and that's a really wonderful thing. Because as we think about family, family isn't just a relationship, a connection on paper. Family is a place. You know, our kids were excited when we had driven away somewhere. Our kids are excited when they see the house and they know that that's the place where we're going to be. It's where our house is. That's where our family is. It's a place and it's a set of processes. It's a set of things that you do over and over and over again that become woven into the fabric of your life. That's a good thing. And we want that to be there too. But number 3, really, as we're going about this journey, we have to be very careful to choose to love. To choose to love God and all that he loves unconditionally. Because as natural as it might be, there are going to be times where that naturality is not going to rise to the level that it needs to. There are going to be times where somebody here makes you angry, and you're not going to want to come that Sunday because you're going to maybe see that person. Well, what do you do then? Natural affection isn't strong enough, and clearly erao, that desire, isn't strong enough in that moment. You don't want to, but you have to make the choice. You have to choose to be there. And there are all kinds of situations that are going to come up in life where again, emotionally, there's going to be strong leadings in the opposite direction. And you're going to have to ignore those and respond to God's call. And then number 4, you can then allow that love that Peter wanted to have for Jesus, allow that to grow out of your commitment, not vice versa. Because I promise you that, again, if your love is based on relationship and emotion, there are going to be points where that relationship is challenged and points where you're emotionally not going to feel like it. That will happen. And your faith has to transcend that. Now, I want to talk about how, as we close out this lesson, how really all of this does get brought back together. And I think this is a wonderful way of preparing for our reflections upon 1 Corinthians 13. And so, Romans chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. I had a brother once point out in a lesson, and I had to really pause and think about that. He said, philos is not commanded anywhere in Scripture. I'm like, now hang on a second, that's not necessarily true. And I've heard people say that storge is not found in Scripture. I'm like, well, that's not exactly true either. And when we think about love, we think about our faith, it really brings all of these concepts together in a beautiful harmony. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verse 9, to let our love, to let our agapao be without hypocrisy, to be without any kind of double-mindedness or without any kind of masks. Abhor, he says, what is evil, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. To fail to do that would, of course, be to have a hypocritical love. And you can almost see in those words cling, like I said, the word erao is not found in the Bible, but maybe the word cling would point us in that direction. But then notice what is said. Be kindly affectionate to one another. A marriage there, etymological marriages are the best kind, aren't they? Except for the real ones. Etymological marriage of the words philos and storge. They're sandwiched together. And what that effectively is saying is, as relates to each other, to one another, we are to allow emotional, relational love to develop to a point where it's natural. Isn't that a beautiful thought? Where that affection is as natural as the affection that we have between a parent and a child. Be kindly affectionate to one another with, in case we missed it, brotherly love. Philadelphia. It sounds like I'm saying the city wrong, but the city's saying the word wrong. but that's the word there. The word delphos, or brother, and again that word philos, and love, emotional, relational, connected love is joined there. And honor, giving preference to one another. This is the place where you discover, hopefully, true love. Where you discover the love of God, and where you get to live out that love. And where, again, as you demonstrate that love to one another, people see you are disciples and the body grows. What is love? I hope that we've gone a little bit of a way towards answering that question, but if it's not totally clear in your mind, that's okay, because like I said, the coming weeks we're going to be delving into 1 Corinthians 13, where God is going to do a lot of teaching into our hearts and minds about the subject of love. But as you approach this topic and as you think about Peter, already maybe you can test where you stand, right? And I can test where I stand. Am I here, clinging to the idea that I love God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, but I've withheld that thing that Jesus felt the need to add, my strength. I've withheld my strength because I haven't made a decision to love that transcends any feeling. Has that been manifested in some way? Is there some way where you have failed to love because, again, you were being guided in that moment by something other than a commitment to love? The beauty of our God is that he is totally and fully committed to the idea of agapao, so much that he can actually be described as agape. He is love. And he will never let us down. Let's do our best to make that commitment in our heart, to be like him in that way and in all ways. If you have any needs, let us know them while we stand and sing this song.